The longsword, a crude weapon from ancient times designed to smash through opponents. Heavy, slow, and brutal. This weapon was the bane of armored knights. All of that's fake. Literally everything I just said is a myth perpetrated by Hollywood, video games, and what have you. So today, we're gonna look at the top 5 myths about the longsword. Let's talk about the first myth, the big one, that the longsword is slow. So the longsword is actually a pretty fast weapon for a number of different reasons. Let's talk about the first one, leverage. This is a one or two-handed weapon. So this is an Albion Talhofer. It is in the design of an earlier longsword, sometime in the 1400s. This was still being used on the battlefield at that time, though it was being phased out. This is what you could call a hand and a half longsword because it can be used in one hand or in two hands. This is an arming sword. This is a one-handed sword. Now these weapons do weigh slightly different amounts, but not by a lot. This and this are comparable. But because I only have one hand to use this sword feels heavier and slower to move around. It's not super slow, but it's not fast. In contrast, because I have two hands on the longsword, this is very maneuverable. I can maneuver it around very quickly, and I have very precise point control. Now, it's not miles faster than the other sword, but the leverage makes a big difference, and I can flick it around pretty quickly. And you can see in this fencing footage how fast the longsword moves. Let's talk about the second myth, that this is an ancient weapon from the Dark Ages, when in reality, this is actually a much more modern weapon. So the arming sword we looked at earlier, while that specific example is a more modern version of it, swords like that have been around for centuries before this weapon ever existed. Longswords really came into prominence in about the very late 1200s into the early 1300s because it's complicated to make swords like this. Making a longer blade that is both strong and flexible was a much more complicated smithing technique than it was to make those shorter blades. So this is a more modern weapon. Myth number 3, the longsword is a crude weapon for smashing your opponents. It's not sharp and it doesn't cut well, unlike the katana. This is another myth mostly born out of Hollywood. Most of the time when you see people fighting with these, they're in full plate armor. Which really didn't happen the way they're depicting it in Hollywood. Yes, armored knights or people in full armor would fight each other with these weapons, but it didn't look like the hacking and slashing that we see on the silver screen. Instead, it was a much more grapple-y and precision striking affair. The two opponents would try and get up into this business using the sword as a leverage tool to maneuver the other person, either trying to throw them to the ground or find the weak points in their armor and stab while doing what I'm doing here, which is called half swording. And yes, they could do this without cutting their hands. What we see in Hollywood is what is generally referred to as Blossfechten, or unarmored combat. Not the actual stuff they're doing because they are in armor, but these strikes that are elongated and reaching and parrying. This is all what we have in systems of unarmored combat, when people are wearing either just plain clothes or maybe some padding, but not metal armor because these cannot cut through metal. Though some of them were designed in such a way, like this one with a bit of a swell in the tip, to be able to puncture through ring mail. And now we come to the fourth myth, which is that long swords are heavy. Now, we've already kind of touched on this myth before when we talked about their speed, but let's talk about how wrong this myth is. This sword weighs about 3 pounds. 3 pounds. Not 30, like some movies want to make it sound, but 3. It doesn't weigh much. this truly is a hand and a half sword. I can use it in one hand or I could use it in two, and most longswords are like that. This sword is also a very average sword. It's not like it weighs a lot less than other swords. Most longswords weighed somewhere between 2.5 and 4 pounds on the heaviest side, which is very similar to the katana. In fact, most katanas weigh somewhere in that 2.5 to 3 pound range. So they're pretty similar. Even though the katana has this reputation of being much faster, it's simply not true. These were light swords. And the last myth is that these were crude and unsophisticated weapons. And this couldn't be farther from the truth. These have complex systems of combat behind them, from Fiore to Lichtenauer's offshoots like Meyer and Ringek. All of the systems are complex and intricate, and two combatants using them against each other create a beautiful dance of death. So, unlike what Hollywood and video games want you to believe, the longsword is not an ancient, crude, unsophisticated, and heavy lump of iron. It is in fact a modern, sophisticated, technologically advanced, and deadly weapon that definitely deserves more respect than it gets.